we are honoured to have by Ranveer Singh ji, who is an author. We'll be talking about the recent book release of the Patshahi Mehima, which Bhai ji has written, and sort of revisiting the Sikh sovereignty that we all have, and what it is, and what's the inspiration behind the book. Firstly, Bhai Sahib, thank you so much for joining. It's great to have you on here. Would you mind just introducing yourself, and just telling us a bit about your background?
Anji, Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Thank you for having me on. So my name is Ranveer Singh. I am a writer and founder of Carlis House Publishing. So that was founded 2 years ago, and we have had 7 publications come out since then. I'm also the co-founder of the National Sikh Youth Federation. Some of those who are in the Discord today may have come across our work before. That's been going for almost 10 years. And yeah, I mean, I'm originally from London, but I'm currently residing in Scotland. And yeah, looking forward to speaking to you about the book this evening.
Thank you, Bhai Sahib, for that introduction. I guess we'll just go straight into it. I mean, Bhai Sahib, what's the sort of what is this book about in a nutshell?
Anji. So the book itself it's a history book first and foremost. So it covers 550 years of our history, starting from Guru Nanak Dev Ji Maharaj up until the present day. But how it differs to other books, especially those books that have been written in English, is that it really attempts to center our sovereignty. It attempts to center Patshahi within the narrative. Because personally, for me, I felt as though that was missing from a lot of the books that are written in English. In Punjabi, or certainly from the Puratan Granths, when we read those and when we do Khoj of those Granths, it's quite clear, it becomes quite obvious quickly that Patshahi, it was an integral part of the Sikh movement, and it was something that they were aware of. Most of the Puratan Granths, they refer to Guru Sahib as Sache Padshah. They talk about that being a key aspect of Sikhi. But like I said, in English, the kind of the narrative is not always consistent. So when authors portray our Itihas, up until around about 1849, give or take, it's usually quite good. But then there's a change in the narrative, and when they depict moments of sovereign Sikh action, whether it's the Gadri Babe, whether it's the Babbar Akali Lahir, whether it's the Khalistan Sangharsh, the language they use, it changes, and they often adopt state narratives that undermine and actually demonize sovereign Sikh action and Sikh resistance. So for me, it was really important to look at that. Uh, in terms of the inspiration, initially the idea was just to try to focus on 1984 and maybe look at a bit of context behind that. But I started the project 7 years ago, prior to publication, and what I found was the further back I went, there was more that was needed to be kind of unpacked and unraveled. So I went to 78, and then I had to go back to 1947 to understand how we got to 1978, and then it wasn't making sense because I had to kind of really break down the colonial encounter. So I went back to 1849, and Holly, slowly I ended up going back to 1469. So initially it was supposed to just be a book focusing on sovereignty within the last kind of 50 to 100 years. But like I said, to give it more context, I went back to 1469 and looked at various different manifestations of sovereignty. So when we think about Sikh Raj, people often go to Maharaja Ranjit Singh, the 40 years of the Sikh Empire that we had. Um, Sometimes people will go back to the Misl period, and sometimes we obviously will go back to Banda Singh Bahadur. But I was looking, so the book itself is split into two main parts. The first half focuses on the Guru Sahibaan, and then the second half on the Khalsa post 1708. And what I wanted to show was that the inspiration for Sikh Raj whether it was Banda Singh Bahadur's Republic, whether it was the Sikh Missile Confederacy, Ranjit Singh's Raj, Maharaja Ranjit Singh's Raj, or obviously the Khalistan Sangharsh, the inspiration for that came from the Gurus themselves. From Kartarpur Sahib to Anandpur Sahib, the Guru's Darbar was also a manifestation of Sikh sovereignty. You know, the Darbar itself was a place where the hukam of Sache Padsha was heard and followed. And when we look at the establishment of, for example, Miri Piri, in terms of the Kal Takht, that was really a moment of cementing that. And that was when the Guru Sahib then created, parallel power structures. But the idea behind that, began with Guru Nanak Dev Ji. So that's something I wanted to showcase in the form of a book. So yeah, like I said, it's a history book, but it really centers the idea of sovereignty. So it focuses more on our political history. Like I said, looking at the manifestations of Raj.
Thanks for that, Bhai Sabji. You touched upon some of the key sort of struggles and the key events throughout history. And when writing this book, obviously you had to do a lot of research. I mean, is it the case that when you were doing your research that you didn't find many sources, or is it just not being told, or what is it that is so important that we can write about this history in such a tangible way?
Well, the thing is, like I said, in terms of our Puratan Granths, people, will have heard of like Suraj Prakash, Panth Prakash, Bansavli Nama, Mehima Prakash, even the Gurbilas, Sri Guru Soba, all of these grants that we've all heard of, and some of us may have had read, certainly bits, if not all of them. They all speak about, when they talk about the Guru, they refer to them as Sache Padsha. In Panth Prakash, like I often say this in my talks in person, when the British first arrived, or rather when they first took over Punjab in 1849, one of the very first questions they asked was, where did the Sikhs get their authority? Who gave them the power to rule? Because they had done their research on various different other kingdoms across South Asia, the Marathas, the Mughals, but one of the very first questions is, yeah, how did Sikhs rule? Who gave them the power? And then the response that comes from Ratan Singh Pangu, which is recorded in Panth Prakash, is he says that it was Sache Padsha, that the Sikhs have the authority to establish Raj and rule because it's bestowed upon us by Sache Padsha. And then Captain Murray, who is a colonial officer, he then asks, well, who is this Sache Padsha? ਫਿਰ ਅੱਗੇ ਉਹ ਜਵਾਬ ਦਿੰਦੇ ਨੇ, they say Guru Nanak Dev Ji. And then there's a bit more exchange. The Gora then says, well, I heard that that Guru Nanak Dev Ji was just a mere fakir, that they were just a saint. What did they know about political office and Raj and establishing kingdoms, etc. And then the response that he gives is he says, Hame kahe wo shehen ko shah, deen duni sacho padsha. That Guru Nanak Dev Ji was the emperor of both worlds, Deen Duni Sacho Padsha. He was a true sovereign. And then Ratan Singh Pangu writes the entire Panth Prakash based on that one question. And like I said, this is something, I think sometimes we kind of focus on perhaps some of the quote unquote controversial things that come up in these grants. And there's space to be having those discussions. But I would say, from my own research, personally speaking, 90 to 95% of what's written in those grants, in terms of how they depict the early period of the Sikh movement, and how they talk about the Guru's Darbar and how it evolved from Kartarpur Sahib to Khadur Sahib, Govindwal Sahib, all the way up to Anandpur Sahib. They're all quite unanimous in terms of how they project that in the language they use. For them, it was quite clear. They're writing in the 18th century, and to them, this political aspect, this idea of like establishing Raj to further Dharam was just a given. It wasn't. And I think that in our minds as a peoples, the change comes when the colonizer arrives in Punjab, because, and this is something that I touch upon in the book as well, is this idea of this idea of religion, like Sikhism. That's really comes about. So before that, it was a Panth, Nanak Panth, um, you know, it was a path, as we all know of how it's referred to in Gurbani as well, and also by Gurdas Ji. But when the colonizer arrives, the way in which they speak about the Sikhs, that's the first time when we are categorized as a peoples as just a religious people. And any kind of, mobilization or any kind of expression of political thought or sovereignty is then sidelined. And the Khalsa themselves are demilitarized. Any resistance is crushed. If anyone has read about the history of Bhai Maharaj Singh, for example, also the early Kuka movement, like I mentioned earlier, the Gadri Babbe, Akali Babbar Leher, all of these kind of moments that arrive, they're just suppressed violently. And this is obviously this is something that the British have done elsewhere in the world. Wherever they've gone to colonize, they've tried to colonize, they've tried to categorize um, an entire people's, into one box. And even that idea of religion is based on, their worldview, what took place in Europe, or, what happened between the church and the state. And it follows obviously the Renaissance period. And so, how they interact with the Sikhs is very much on their own terms. So the things that they create to describe us, it comes from their own imagination. So that was something really important that I felt needed to be highlighted because, in our pre-colonial literature, all of the Puratan Granths, this idea of the Sikhs being just a religion, especially, a westernized idea of religion, that's not there. Um, it was more kind of more of a wholesome, Panth, which had both obviously the dharmic, the spiritual aspect, but also the political aspect as well, with the establishment of especially of Midi Pidi, and then later on the Khalsa. Um, so yeah, so looking at that specifically, and that also explains, why, in some history books, these narratives which demonize Sikh resistance, why they exist, because they're viewing the Sikh people and they're trying to portray them just as quote unquote the fifth largest religion in the world. But for us, in terms of our own Sikh scholars prior to 1849, it's a whole different worldview. And we have remnants of that continue to come forward. But like I said, any expression towards that way is violently suppressed. I guess the most recent example of that is the response to expressions of Sikh sovereignty following 1984 with the Sarbat Khalsa in 86, and the call for Khalistan, the way in which the state mobilized to violently suppress Sikhs, and how it continues to do that. So I felt that was really important to understand, where that categorization comes from, and how it's not there really in the way in which Sikh scholars writing before 1849, how they depict the Sikh Panth, and the development of the Sikh Panth both during the Guru period and then following that. Again, Ratan Singh Bangu writes, when he's talking about that period between 1708 and 1849, he says, "Ke Sikh Raj kare ya Sikh lar mare," that either the Sikhs established Raj, or they died in the pursuit of establishing Raj. That was our entire history between 1708 and roughly the middle of the 19th century. But when the colonizer comes, that's when things start to change. So there's 3 chapters dedicated to looking specifically at that, the colonial encounter, the intrusion of Western secular thought, how that affected Sikh mobilization, and then the idea of Indian nationalism and how that also affects Sikh sovereignty.
Find you some amazing points there. I think sometimes when we think about books and sort of the narrative and the time it takes to write them, I think a lot of Sangat really don't understand or comprehend how long it takes to sort of write these things and research. So no, thank you so much for putting in the time and effort for actually just doing that. And just the question that sort of popped into some of the Sanghat's heads here, and I've got some questions coming up as well. That on your journey of doing this research, was there anything that really stood out to you as a shock, or as something which you thought, is this was this really that happened? Was it something that was a shock to the system?
You know what? There was loads of moments where, because obviously I had heard Sikh Itihas, from others. I'd read certain books. You hear Katha, you'll watch YouTube videos, you'll read forums, etc. Um, and for me, it was that disconnect between our Patshahi and whatever else has been portrayed about the Sikh Panth. Like, nowadays, we proudly say that we are the fifth largest religion in the world, but what does that actually mean? And who are we speaking to when we say that? Because in many ways, what I've kind of come to realize or conclude is that that's not our language. That's not to say that we don't have, the dharmic aspect. Clearly we do. And, when we read Gurbani, the idea of, like, Sarbat Pala, Sanji Valta, Parapakari, all these, like, ideals that Guru Sahib gives us, they exist. But it's almost as if there's that disconnect between, what we what the gyan we take from Ilahi Bani, and then how we kind of act upon that to bring it into being in the world, and how we kind of manifest that. So, like, Raj, and we say Raj Karega Khalsa, that is such an important aspect of who we are, and that's been there from the beginning. Like with Guru Nanak Dev Ji Maharaj, when they go on their Udasiya, when they come back to Punjab, the very first thing they do is they purchase land. So they, Kartarpur Sahib, they establish what I would term sovereign Sikh territory. I mean, it's not hard borders as we know it today, because the European nation state is a different animal altogether. But in terms of what they do when they come back, and we often go to the Audacia, where they overtly call out hypocrisy and falsehood and exploitation, and they have these interactions with the Sids, and obviously what happens in the Middle East, and also down south as well, in all four directions. But I think, personally, my own kind of learning prior to this research is there's that key moment when they come back to Punjab and they settle. And like I said, the first thing they do is they establish that space where Sikhs can exist, where they can cultivate the Gurmukh, essentially. When they speak about they speak about Gurmukh and the importance of Gurmukh consciousness as well. Other writers like Sardar Kapoor Singh have written about this. Sardar Jagjit Singh in their book as well. Bhai Gurdas, he speaks about the kind of the creation of the Gurmukh. So there was a physical space was needed in order to do that, and then the way in which the Guru Sahiban then strategically move, is really important as well, to understand. Like Guru Angad Dev Ji Maharaj, they are given the hukam to go to Khadur Sahib. Um, Guru Amar Das Ji themselves are then given a separate hukam when they become Guru to go to Govindal Sahib, and that kind of continues. And for me, what I kind of noticed within that was that the most important aspect of the Guruship was to retain that sovereignty of the Guru's Darbar. So whenever there was a threat, and at that time it was kind of internal, that the sons were vying for the Guru's throne. I don't need to go into the heart of that, but that was an important part of that early development, that retaining that autonomy. And then obviously, we have Amritsar Sahib, and then if I can give one thing to answer your question, it was reading about the fact that for approximately 60 years between Guru Hargobind Sahib Padsha and Nove Padsha, Guru Tegh Bahadur Ji, there's a period of about 60 years where the Guru doesn't come back to Amritsar Sahib. So they've set up their darbar in Kiratpur, and that's because of the way in which Amritsar has been basically it's under occupation by external forces. So for me, that highlights again the importance of retaining that sovereignty of wherever Guru Sahib is, because they didn't bow to any other worldly power. They were Sache Patsha themselves. They were given the Sikhs divine knowledge, but they were also given them guidance and direct orders on how to govern, essentially, how to self-govern. So that was, and like I said, the Puratan Granths, when we read them in a kind of comparison to compare with each other as comparative kind of history, they all speak to the idea of, like I said at the beginning, the sovereignty of the Guru's Darbar. And even today, you can go to any Gurukar in the world, and the place where Guru Granth Sahib Ji Maharaj is, Birajman on their takht, we call that space Darbar Sahib. We don't call it a prayer room. We don't call it a worship center, or any other terminology. For us, it's Darbar Sahib because it was a court. And even like there's a Chandoa Sahib, there's a Shastrtari Gursikh always on duty. Um, the throne itself, all of these are kind of hallmarks of what would have been at one point a physical sovereign space, just like the other worldly powers had their own courts and their darbars. We have the Nagara, we have the Narsinga, we have the Nishan Sahib. Um, so these were given to us, and not just given to us, but actually used and brought into practice during the Guru period. So, but like I said, there was many moments of kind of learning, unlearning, and relearning for myself. There was a lot of self-development. I mentioned it took 7 years. That's because that process of writing, when you do your own research independently, and you go back to the primary source material in some cases, in most cases, in fact, you get to see, you get to analyze and evaluate and then present, the writings of, for example, Bhai Gurdas Ji, or Gurbani, or, like I said, the Puratan Granths, with a kind of almost like an original kind of perspective, because you're not really relying on second, third um, understandings of that, especially when those perspectives have been tainted by what took place following the colonial encounter. So yeah, there was many moments of that, but that for me would be the main one, just to recognize how Patshahi was an integral part of the Sikh movement right from the offset.
Thank you very much for answering that. So, just some of the questions from the Sangha that we're getting on here. Um, what was the barriers when writing the book, and what was the biggest struggle?
I'd say the biggest struggle, in terms of, and also barriers, was in terms of the research, because I did this whilst here in the UK. So I ordered books in from Punjab, um, but I didn't have an opportunity to go to, for example, a university in Punjab and maybe read a manuscript there, or sit down with somebody. It was very much just done independently, almost remotely, if you like, from what I could find on the internet. I mean, there are some really good resources, but yeah, buying those books from Punjab was something that I obviously I had to do. I'm talking specifically about like the Puratan Granths, and also some of the early books that were written in Punjabi. Um, and the other thing, I guess, was in terms of language. So a lot of the Puratan Granths, they are written in Braj Bhasha. So I don't speak Braj. I don't read. I mean, like, obviously I can read Gurmukhi, but I had to rely on the editor's notes of whoever. For example, like Gyani Gyan Singh has written a Panth Prakash as well. Naveen Panth Prakash, and Bhai Veer Singh has done, like, he's got an edited version of that. Same with Mehima Prakash. So relying on on somebody else's interpretation of that was a little bit of a challenge. Um, so I guess if I was maybe to do this again, I'd maybe want to try and learn Braj Bhasha, just because you have that, then you have that direct connection with the script and the language within which that piece of work was written. Um, so I'd say that was probably the biggest challenge. And also, personally for me, because I did this on a part-time basis, I work full-time, just trying to manage my time, writing and researching alongside work and raising a family and all the other things that come along with that. So I'd say, yeah, that was probably a big challenge as well.
Thank you for that. Answering that question. Definitely, working, full time, part time, and with your own sort of commitments as well. It's a great challenge, but I think, we're all grateful that you've written this amazing book. I'm just going to the next question now. So, someone might have not have joined a bit later on, so they're asking. Um, how long did the book take to write, and did any organisations attempt to interfere? Or I would spin the question to say, did any organisations help as well to help you write the book?
So this book, like I said before, took 7 years. But in terms of if you're asking how long does a book take, obviously it depends on what the book is and the length of it, what you're trying to cover. So that obviously varies. In terms of support, there was a handful of Gursikhs, here in the UK, that I was kind of, having ongoing kind of vichar with back and forth. When I'd stumble across something new, just to have that discussion and get their thoughts on it. But this is why, why Carly's House was set up, just to give that platform to aspiring writers, people, people like myself who wanted to present and put forward basically, a book. Because for me, when the manuscript was ready, or well, certainly the first draft, I did send it to like a mainstream publisher, and there was just no response. And then I was speaking to a couple of the other things, and I said, look, maybe it's an opportunity for us to create our own platform, so that we can obviously control the narrative, which is hugely important. But two, it makes certain that the work is put out as well, and there's a degree of control over that as well, from initial marketing to production to post production and what have you. So yeah, that's why Carlos House was founded. And like I said at the beginning, we've had 7 publications since then because others have come forward. We have a bunch of novels that have been written, some poetry books as well, and there are others currently in the pipeline as well. So we kind of took a decision to stay away from the charity model, because I think there's a lot of people who are doing a lot of good work, and everyone is giving their dasband, and we felt as though we could kind of create a model that was funding, or becoming, or that would become self-sustainable quite quickly, because obviously when you produce a book, somebody buys it, and that goes back into the organization to create more. So that's the model that we've kind of adopted, with Carlos House.
Angie. So the next question that we have here is, what advice would you give aspiring Sikh authors, and how can we support Sikh writers?
That's a really good question. I think, the advice I'd give to anyone listening, in terms of, if you've got an idea, just run with it. Just write. Just start writing, because the first thing you write will not be the final publication. You yourself will develop as a writer. The ideas will develop, and when you put thoughts to paper naturally on any subject. Even if you think about school and college and university, your essays and stuff, that they always develop. You always have various drafts. So the first thing would be just to get started, get your thoughts down on paper, even if it's a rough kind of sketch, rough kind of model of what it is you want to present. And then you can obviously refine and fine tune it later on. So because sometimes I think people often, like first time writers, they speak about the imposter syndrome, that sometimes you have self-doubt as well in moments, especially when you're writing a book. You might think, well, am I worthy of writing this book, or what qualifies me? But if it's something you feel passionate about, and something you feel is missing, or it needs to be further clarified, or challenged even, then that shouldn't stop you from doing so. So yeah, the first thing would be to write it down, and just have that self-belief as well. Again, one of the reasons why Carly's House was set up was to encourage writers within the Panth, especially so within the diaspora, especially so within English work. So we've actually, this is the second year now we've ran a writing contest called Khalis Lekak. Last year's winner was Harmanjeet Kaur Sidhu, who released a short novel, a time travel novel about, based on a Sikh character. and this year we're running the contest again. So again, it's to encourage writers on different genres, not just like non-fiction work, but fiction work like novels, poetry, prose, anything. Because that's I think that's something which we've kind of not neglected, but sometimes I think I personally feel as though as a community we ought to be reading more and also encouraging us each other to write as well. So if you've got a story to share, just get started. And if anybody listening has written something in draft form and wants it to be read over, or just if there's anything you want to clarify or check, we're happy to do that. You can always send us an email, info@khalidhouse.com. Whether you choose to publish through us or not, that's not the issue here. The main thing is that we have that support network for writers who want to write about Sikhi or matters related to Punjab.
Yeah, so as Baisab just said there, we'll post the links to the website and to the email contact information on Discord as well. So, Baisab, another question's come in to ask you, what authors inspire you?
Oh, that's a really good question. So I mentioned a couple already. Sardar Jagjit Singh. They inspire me. They wrote a book called Percussions of History. They've written a few books, but that one's one that really is one that I often go back to. Um, and the main kind of thing that I take away from that book, there's a lot to take away. Something it's one that I'd highly recommend. But there's one particular point that he stresses a lot, and he speaks about like how the Sikh Panth is unique. We talk about Vakri Qaum and this idea of Nyara Panth, and basically what he details is that he says that sometimes we take this for granted, I think, but he details how the Guru Saiban, how they created the Sikh Panth outside of Brahmanism and the caste system. And it might be something quite obvious, but that was a really radical thing to do, 400 or 500 years ago, because of the way in which Brahmanism had a stronghold over society. The Sikh Panth was a first. That's why again we refer to as a Tisar Panth, and this kind of is related to this idea of sovereignty being such an important part of the Panth, and especially Patshahi. So he details that from and he compares the Sikh Panth to the other kind of movements that try to break away and try to challenge and stand up against the stranglehold of Brahmanism. And then he details how they ultimately failed, and how with the creation of the Khalsa that was then cemented for the Sikhs forever going forward. So his books, Sardar Jagjit Singh's work is really inspiring. Sardar Kapoor Singh's work, and some of you may have heard of them as well. And then also like Punjabi books in Punjabi as well. Gyani Song Singh Sito's work is something that I always go back to. And the beauty of Punjabi books is that there's just a kind of like just a different vibe that you get. Now, you could read something in English, you could take in all the facts, you can take in all the details, all the statistics, historically could be accurate. But when you're reading a book in Punjabi, provided obviously that it is historically correct, because you have that license to be poetic, because Punjabi, naturally speaking, is such a beautiful language. You just get a different experience. So again, I'd recommend Gyani Sohan Singh Sito's work. I mean, I often just like going to the library in the Gurdwara, because the libraries tend to have these like hidden gems that no one's really heard of. They're usually kind of tired, old-looking books, but there's so much within them. So and I think a lot of work is needed to preserve that work as well. So yeah, that's just a few people that inspire me.
Thanks for that, Baisab. So, just a final few questions here that are coming in. As a writer, how do you get over creative blocks?
Yeah. See, it's different because when you're writing like a non-fiction work, you can just plow through it because you're covering events that took place in history, right? Obviously, you're presenting them within a particular narrative. You're trying to make a particular point, make certain connections. So, I didn't really get the blocks with Patshahi and Mehima because really the work had been done before me. Like I said, with the Panth and Grants, it was just a case of taking that information and contextualizing it around Sikh sovereignty, and especially so post 1849 to present that narrative of how central Sikh sovereignty is. But with, for example, like Rani Sadakor, the novel that I wrote, although it was based on Gyanitar Lok Singh's work from the 1950s, it differs. So there was new chapters put into that, and there were moments where I felt I did have that creative block. But for me, I think the beauty of writing about Sikhi and our Tihas and our heroes and is we have that kind of that spiritual mystical aspect where you can just take a moment to maybe do some simran or maybe just reflect on how great they were. So that's something that I did when I was writing Rani Sadakor, and that's how I was able to kind of just go through it. But it's something you can't really force it. If you do hit a creative block, just take a step back, to take your time, reflect a little, maybe go over some of the scenes, look at different kind of character lines, arcs, etc. Um, and yeah, just obviously don't be disheartened by that because every writer will speak to you about that, and they'll say that it happens. And I guess it's more common when you're creating a novel from scratch. When you're writing an original novel, because it's literally coming from your own imagination. When you're relying on our itihas, and if you're writing a historical novel, then that's less of an issue.
Hanji. Next question that we have here is, what is your favorite section of the Patshahi Mehima book?
My favorite section would have to be the Khalistan Sangharsh because the first that's obviously the last chapter. So all of the work before that has been kind of coming to this point to try and contextualize what took place in 1984 and also in 1986. And it's difficult to find accounts in English that do that. Again, like I said at the beginning, in Punjabi we have that, but a lot of the books that people kind of refer when people ask about Sikh history or even specifically on 84, a lot of those books carry those same problems with narrative in terms of how they portray. Um, like I always speak about Kushwant Singh's work, how he calls our Shaheeds terrorists and extremists in his portrayal. Um, Even like Fighting for Faith and Nation, um, Cynthia Kepler Mahmood, she talks about the Babbar Khalsa in the same way and in certain aspects. So it's difficult to find a piece of work in English which doesn't do that. And that's something that I really wanted to push back against. And when you've presented Sikh Itihas through the lens that I have, where you're centering Patshahi, where you're centering Gurmat, where you are talking about Sikh sovereignty throughout the ages, it's naturally very easy then to talk about, you know, 84 and the Khalistan Sangharsh through the same language.
Thank you. See if there's any other questions from Sangat. Sangat, feel free to unmute and ask by sub directly as well, if you'd like to. Um, I think by sub the only questions remain is, where can you tell us, Sangat, where can we actually buy the book, and is the book available internationally? We've got Sangat from Canada asking as well, so and there's a question about costs and things like that. So if you just enlighten us where we can get the book and things like that.
Yeah, so the book is available from carlishouse.com, but it's also available from Amazon markets around the world. So Amazon.com for people in the States, .ca obviously in Canada, and it's also available in Australia and Europe as well. Um, I think for anyone who has Prime, it's obviously quite quick delivery turnaround. Um, if you're ordering from the UK and you order from the website, it's usually about 2 to 3 days. But yes, it's readily available across the Amazon markets. It's not available on Kindle just yet, and we are working on an audiobook version as well. So we're hoping to have that ready soon. But at the moment, it's carlishouse.com or Amazon markets around the world.
And we'll paste those links in our Discord channel as well. So you can always go to those links and purchase the books that way. That has been incredibly sort of informative, and just to know your thoughts behind the book as well. By sub, it just leaves me to just sort of thank you for coming on, and taking the time out to sort of talk to us, and answering some of the questions that we have from the Sangath. And we would love to have you back on, to talk about the future books, and even sort of general ideas and think tanks that we run on the Sikh Discord. So, Baisab, just a very big thank you for coming on as well. Is there any last sort of words or comments that you want to say?
Yeah, thank you as well very much. What I will say is, if anybody listening is reading the book, or if you go ahead and purchase the book now, please do let me know how you're finding it, or how you find it. One of the main things of having again our own publishing um, company and this space is that we can actually have this conversation can continue. And the book is quite some of the ideas in terms of how they're presented are quite new when I compare them to other books that have been written about the Sikhs and history. So it would be great to hear your thoughts, positive or constructive. You can send them to me via Instagram, or again the email that I mentioned before. Would love to hear the thoughts of Sangat as well. And yeah, again, thank you once again for having me on.
Thank you, Paisabji. And that's all for this week's event. If you would like to hear more, please feel free to subscribe to our sort of various social media platforms, our YouTube channel as well, where we upload various talks that we've done in the past. The YouTube link is www.youtube.com/Sikh Discord, and you can find out all of our talks that we've uploaded. And if there's any other questions, feel free to ask one of the moderators, or leave your comments with us so we can improve. So just thank you once again to Baisab for coming in and joining in and giving us their thoughts, and thank you Sangaji for joining in as well. ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕਾ ਖਾਲਸਾ ਵਾਹਿਗੁਰੂ ਜੀ ਕੀ ਫਤਿਹ